Hi everyone, I'm Suma and I'm here with Doug, John, Geoffrey, Mateo, and Marco. Today we are going to discuss the book Life Divine by Sri Aurobindo. Life Divine is a major philosophical work of Sri Aurobindo. He presents a theory of evolution and the transformation of a human being and advent of divine life on earth. I think it would be nice to hear introduction from you all directly from you. So maybe I could go kind of in an anti-clockwise direction, and I could first start with Geoffrey. Geoffrey, if you want to introduce yourself first.
Hi, I'm Geoffrey Edwards. I live in Quebec City in Canada, and I've been involved in the Infinite Conversations for about 4 years. And when I read The Life Divine with the group, it was my first introduction to Aurobindo. But now I'm heavily into a number of different texts by Aurobindo. So I've had a chance to expand my reading of Aurobindo in the last 3 years.
Marco, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Marco Morelli. I'm a poet and writer and one of the co-founders of a Cosmos Cooperative, along with the Infinite Conversations forum, discussion platform, metapsychosis journal, and probably some other things I'm forgetting about. But my background coming into Aurobindo is that I had read about him through another philosopher, a contemporary integral philosopher named Ken Wilber. And so I'd kind of gotten Wilber's interpretation or schematic of Aurobindo's thought, and he found a lot of correlations between Aurobindo and other thinkers. But I hadn't read him myself, and one of the things that we began doing on this platform is diving into the works of integral philosophers, and we started with Jean Gebser, in fact, and read through his opus, The Ever-Present Origin. And at a certain point I don't know, but it was that discussion or another one, but the idea, perhaps it came through John, of following our reading of Gebser with the reading of Aurobindo came up. And it probably took a year or year and a half or so until all the forces aligned. But we finally decided to set aside a chunk of time, I think 6-8 months, which we thought, I thought was a lot of time. It was nothing for this work. And we did it. That was in 2018, and we went, maybe a chapter a week. I don't remember the exact way we broke it up, and recorded all of our sessions, which you watched. And that was my real initiation into Sri Aurobindo's thought. And it was much, I wouldn't say different in the sense of Wilber didn't get it wrong, but the direct experience was totally different. Of reading his work and I guess attuning to the thought that he was proposing to us. And so since that time, I've gone on to continue reading some other works of Aurobindo. We're now in the early stages still of a reading of Savitri, his epic poem. And I pick up little other texts here and there, but for now, that's been the extent of my engagement. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Marco. Mateo, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, Suma. Thanks for putting this together, and it's nice to be here with you all. I'm a big fan of Infinite Conversations. The platform that you all have put together is it's revolutionary because I stand for depth and connecting with depth and helping each other on the way in this world where things are breaking down, and there's clearly something really special emerging, and my life is dedicated to being with people who are working on those lines. So it's Infinite Conversations is to me it's a revolutionary evolutionary platform. And it was lovely to be a part of this group. My experience with Sri Aurobindo and the Mother and integral yoga and Auroville go back to 2003, and a mutual friend of Marco's and mine let me know that this group was happening, and introduced me to Marco, connected me with Marco, and he invited me in. And it was, for me, the experience. We read 50 pages a week, just to remind you, Marco. It wasn't a chapter a week, and it's a lot of depth to process in a 1-2 hour meeting. I felt like a number of times we were like, whoa, how do we even start, and how do we even approach this? And there are a lot of different methods and suggestions and styles that came forward. So it was a real pleasure for me. And it was hard to read at that pace, and I was traveling and all the other stuff that's going on with life. But at the end, wow, it was special. I'm really happy I participated.
Thank you, Mateo. Doug, would you like to introduce yourself? I think
he may be traveling.
Okay.
He may be on the road.
John, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm a writer. I live in Manhattan. I have a theater background. My first love, my literary hero, was Shakespeare. And when I came to New York, I come from the South, in Texas. When I came to New York, I got a chance to play. I was in a Shakespeare repertory company, so I got a chance to play a lot of Shakespearean roles. And so I have a great love of language. And I feel that Aurobindo really taps into that. And I did read The Life Divine with the group, which was really exciting. And I was able to do some exercises with the group. And I also read Future of Poetry by Aurobindo. He was, of course, steeped in the classics, and he knew Shakespeare very, very well as Milton. And we're now in a Milton study group. I think that's running along with the Savitri study group. So I think Aurobindo and his love of language and his ability to communicate enormously complex states of body and mind, and also to work philosophically and to create frameworks for those experiences that he had. And he was a radical. He really worked hard to get the British out of India at great risk to himself. And I think he's had some of his great spiritual openings while he was in prison. So I'm just thrilled that we're having this opportunity to reflect again on this marvelous writer and thinker. Thank you.
I think this book is quite comprehensive and it's very extensive, and it's going to be a challenge to provide to summarize it and provide a synopsis. But if you had to summarize this book for someone who hasn't read this before, how would you describe it? Geoffrey, I'll start with you first.
I'm always on the spot first. Good question. Because I talk to a lot of people about this, and some people are familiar with who he was, and other people have no idea, So I tend to present Aurobindo as a groundbreaking thinker interested in linking religions, partly because that's one of my own interests. I didn't say who I was in terms of what I do in life, but I write science fiction, and part of the science fiction I write deals with religion and the way different religions come together. And Aurobindo speaks to those things in my own efforts. I did this before I encountered Aurobindo, and now I'm still struggling to find a way to integrate his ideas into my own. But so I tend to think, so the life divine, I mean, it's more than the linking of religion. It's just that's the entry point for me into Aurobindo. The life divine, it has this, we think of this, so Aurobindo has this idea that the divine comes down into the world in a process that he calls involution, all the way down to the bottom of the world. And then it turns around and then comes out, back out of the world through the process of evolution. And the Life Divine as a book does something similar. It has those two movements inside the book, which make it actually very poetic to read, even though it sometimes feels very abstract as a reading, but there's a poetic vision to the whole, which comes through even in the more abstruse parts of reading Aurobindo. The other thing is it's the kind of book I think that is better read in a group than individually. But I tend to find that about all of Aurobindo's writings. They're easier to understand because Aurobindo writes very densely. So Mateo, you mentioned that we were reading 50 pages a week, which was huge. I mean, these days when I read Aurobindo in groups, we sometimes don't get through a paragraph in a 2-hour session because it's so dense. And so now when I think back about reading 50 pages a week, I don't know how we did it, because it's extremely packed with information. And so obviously you don't get the same, you don't take the same out of it as you do if you really dive into each sentence the way we do these days. But so it's more of an overview that you get. So it's this journey, the Life Divine. It's a journey along with Aurobindo's ideas of this involutionary process down, and then this evolutionary process back out through and then he describes all the different stages or states, I guess, maybe, of the process. I don't know if that does a very good job of explaining. I'm sure the others will do.
Yeah. That's a good introduction to his work. Marco, how would you describe, how would you summarize Sri Aurobindo's book?
Well, first I'll say that I think that even though I wouldn't necessarily do it the same way again, there was something important about reading the whole book and going through the journey, going through one cycle of the journey, really, because it would be a kind of journey that you could repeat multiple times and each time deepen. And I think that what the book is about is, if I were to summarize it, it's a vision of a possible human future in which consciousness and the qualities that we associate with transhuman, divine, infinite consciousness are brought into manifestation through ourselves, through matter, body, life, mind. And so what Geoffrey was saying about the involution and evolution, those are, as I understand them, two simultaneous movements that consciousness is undergoing in its different forms, its formlessness and its forms. As it works out, everything that it takes for the world, or everything that we experience as reality, the world, materiality, to become manifest and divinized. And that's something that it's a human future in a sense that we can collectively move in that direction as a humanity. And that's what I think is so exciting about it, that it's a positive vision of something beyond the chaos that we experience right now. But it's also, and this is kind of the, I think, esoteric part, is something that in some sense is already realized. And who Aurobindo was, and not just as a philosopher or as a poet, but as a realizer, I think is something that we attune to through reading his work, and that awakens potentialities for realization within ourselves. And then that becomes part of how we like fulfill this human aspiration that he writes about in the very first chapter of The Life Divine. He says that in the end of the day, humanity, whatever else we explore, whatever else we do, science, world conquest, etc., we always come back to to consciousness. We always come back to those qualities and those realities. And so, he proceeds then to tell a very encompassing story about how that happens. And it's still, I think, a story that is filtering into our world. It's something that a few people have read, and it's unique, but it's not alone. And it's one way, I think, of approaching the divine that, particularly, I think, spoke to me and can speak to, certain people, because he's so literary, and he's such a wonderful writer, and he's so steeped not only in the Eastern traditions of the Vedas, the Upanishads, and the whole history of Indian philosophy, but also in the West, and Shakespeare, Milton, the Bible. Like he sort of was at this unique intersection point, just because by virtue of his arising in India and moving to England and studying there, then returning and being part of this anti-colonial struggle, but then through that finding that they're sort of thinking through it, and thinking through to the much further past, beyond just that particular struggle, but the human struggle. So I'm not sure if that counts as a summary, but that's like how I might begin speaking about this with somebody else. And so thank you for that invitation to share that.
Thank you, Marco. Mateo, would you like to go next and give your summary of the book?
I think the title really summarizes it well. The life divine. That's the aspiration. It's it was written very early in Sri Aurobindo's contact with the mother. It's a very mentalized form of our human potentiality, and it's filled with Marco used the word realization, potential for realization. I'll go just a tiny bit deeper in saying realization is to make these states concrete and accessible and more integrated on with more parts of ourselves. This work came out of the higher mind before the yoga of Sri Aurobindo and the mother transitioned and shifted to having the yoga happen in the vital regions, and then later shifted to having it happen in the physical region. So I do also think that it's really important to not think that this book exemplifies Sri Aurobindo even closely, or integral yoga even closely. It's a work trying to answer the question, why do we do this? Why do we move to think that we can collaborate in the evolution of human consciousness? And I love that Geoffrey brought up the word journey. I think that the group was titled Journey to Supermind, and I never asked how that came about, but journey is a nice word. I always had resonance with that word for this approach.
Thank you, Mateo. Doug, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, Doug, is it a good time for you to share a little bit about your summary of the book?
I'm unable to turn on my video. Can you hear me with the audio clearly, or clear enough?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so I think so far the summary of the summaries is a good take on what the book is about. And I like the idea of the book being read as a group. I think that is important. Part of what Aurobindo closes in the last chapter is the idea of attempting to form these communities. So he's gone through kind of the individual seeking out, taking that journey to go through the life, to seek out the life divine, and not necessarily just how to do it, but the whole process. And then it comes to a close of almost the impossibility of forming the communities around it, while at the same time we still take that journey. As Marco said, there's that aspiration. He begins with the human aspiration, and there's that drive to just, no matter how dark we turn or how deep we go in alternate directions, we have that drive towards that divine life. And I find that as an individual, sometimes in our best moments, we can sense it, we can feel it. But it's so much better when we can sense and feel that as a group with like-minded souls. And the more and more that we incorporate the others, go from the I to the we, I feel that creates a much better image of the divine life.
Thank you, Doug. John, do you want to share your summary of the book?
Yes, I think it's about a crisis, a civilizational crisis. I just want to quote him very briefly. The world today presents the aspects of a huge cauldron of Medea, in which all things are being cast, shredded into pieces, experimented on, combined and recombined, either to perish and provide the scattered material of new forms, or to emerge rejuvenated and changed for a fresh term of existence. I think that's very carefully chosen. Medea, a cauldron of Medea. Medea, as we may recall, is a sorceress who, to get back at her husband for his infidelity, murdered their children. So I think this is very dark kind of energetics that often happen in all of his books as he's grappling with evil. And I think we're dealing with evil on a very large scale right now. I'm also very attracted to, I've been watching your Suma, your interviews, and many of the people participating, I think, are very kindred spirits. There's a lot of talk about contact modalities, such as lucidity, lucid dreams, out-of-body experience, telepathy, precognition, near-death experience, interdimensional entities, beings of light, UFOs, both in the physical and the perhaps trans-physical aspect. I think these kinds of experiences, if you've ever had these experiences, you will find yourself pretty much in like, well, how do I understand these? How do I hold the tensions that these experiences have created in my psyche? Because they are very, I think, appear often in crisis, especially civilizational crisis such as we're now in. So I think there's a lot of experimentation going on, as especially we're being confronted by virtual reality and the use of technology, and the dark side of that, which we have to deal with, and also the opportunities that the virtual provides us with, such as this meeting today of kindred spirits studying Aurobindo. So I think that's the overlaps, I think, between his time and ours are extremely resonant. And so that's why I think of him as an epic. And I think he gives a direction to what could become a breakdown. If we don't have a direction, and a direction that's better, I think we're very prone to breaking down rather than breaking through. So I would say, in a way, this is a kind of a manual, in a way, for those of us who've had extremely anomalous experiences, and for helping us to ground and to stay active in our social worlds. As he cautions many of his readers in his time and place, how it's very important to stay grounded and active, and rather than to escape into a kind of monastic, solipsistic orientation. So I think this is a big challenge for all of us. So thank you.
It's interesting how some of the stuff that he wrote in those days, it's still relevant now. We still have the same questions. This time I'm thinking about going in a clockwise direction so that Geoffrey gets a break from being the first person to answer. My next question was about what were some of the insights that stood out for you personally when you first read the book. John, I'm going to start with you. Like, what were some of the insights that stood out personally for you?
Well, it's sort of like the ebb and the flow of the word music. I read it as poetry. I know it's a philosophical text, but it's hard for me to put it in so that ebb and that flow, and those affective zones, those liminal zones that occur, that I think really attracts me, because I think he's trying to fashion a coherent response to his own interior process. And he does reference that in other works. He doesn't do it in Life Divine, but he does talk about his experience in the resistance to India and his imprisonment as a terrorist. It's hard for us we often forget that. We think of him as this elderly, stately sage, but he was actually accused of terrorism. So I think his experiences in prison as he was dealing with that at those very extreme events is of great interest to me, and how he found a way of creating coherence for himself and for others, because that was very important for him, that he engaged others, and he created a community that became world famous. So I'm very interested, and I think he was as well, in social movements, because I'm an activist, basically. I'm a gay activist. I've worked in the area of AIDS and gay activism since the 80s, and especially in the 90s. So I was very aware of the culture wars and how we didn't have any models or maps for dealing with the incredible turbulence of our time. And we're still in that. I mean, I think it's grand that the Supreme Court was able to side with the LGBTQ community. And just a week before that, we see this horrific murder of George Floyd. So we're seeing these incredible movements, Black Lives Matter and the LGBT movement and other movements, I think, around the world, hopefully can start to cohere, and we can work with what's coming at us. And I believe Aurobindo was an immensely creative person and had enormous optimism. And certainly he recognized the dark side and he didn't flee from it. But he had a great optimism that we were talking about transhuman and posthuman. I think he would question that considerably, that the new human that's starting to emerge can use he didn't know much about virtual reality, but we do. We can use virtual reality. We can work with the subtle realms and the subtle bodies, and we can work with the physical, and we can do it better than we've ever had to do it before. And I think that's very front and center in my attention. And I think many of our attentions were really focused on this, because he was a visionary, and that visionary is in all of us. So I think we need to make it public. That's my aspiration. I think he did a beautiful job of showing how to do that. Thanks.
Thank you. Mateo, do you want to share some of the insights that stood out for you personally?
I'm just kind of basking in John's answer, so I have to transition a little bit. What a beautiful answer. Yes, I also see myself as an activist, a spiritual activist. How can we activate ourselves more and more? How can we help each other activate more and more? And then John mentioned this as a manual for that. Yes, the entire collected works of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother is this vast manual. To say that the Mother's work on the consciousness of the cells created an entirely new field is like an understatement that I feel like no one even knows about. It's complete. I don't want to say it's untapped because I'm surrounded by people that know about it, but it's untapped. This is not critical. This is not critical mass knowledge at all. And I would think if anyone's interested, I would really recommend Sat Prem's compilation, The Mind of the Cells, to start kind of getting into that. But insights specifically from the Life Divine. Oh my goodness, what a huge question, Suma. Yeah, from this group, it helped me. I was introduced to Sri Aurobindo in 2003, like I said, and then I started with Savitri. That was the first Sri Aurobindo book that I completed, pass through. Then around 2007, I sat in a cafe every morning and read Life Divine for 45 minutes or an hour before work every day. And that was my first pass through the Life Divine. And then around 2011, 2012, I had another pass through it. But what we did together, because we had this 50-page-a-week cycle with each chapter, I took it as an opportunity when I could. I would say half the time I had one pass through those chapters representing 50 pages. But in a lot of cases, I had a lot of spaciousness and time, so I was doing multiple passes through the chapters, and I think John also talked about a rhythm with it. There's and I think he said ebbing and flowing. I don't approach it as poetry like John does. I approach it as mantra and meditation. My aspiration is to come into contact with the vibrational force of it. And so it completely bypasses me to be able to explain the Life Divine philosophically. I almost can't do it. I'm like not wired for it because I'm not reading it to be able to teach it or anything. I'm not reading it to be able to explain it. I try to do my best to let go of that and just bask in the mantra. And I feel like I'm not even answering your question, Suma. There's so many and too many inspiring points to get at. If anyone's listening and they want to be directed to it, just the first chapter, the human aspiration, is 5 pages. It's just, it almost says it all. I've heard Marco quote one of the first lines of the second or third paragraph saying all problems of existence are essentially problems of harmony. And John quoted the Cauldron of Medea. That's the first chapter of the Synthesis of Yoga, which is incredibly powerful also. It's too many, Suma. There's like, it's a way. I've never encountered, with the Life Divine and all of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother's work, I've never encountered such a full understanding of the occult worlds that we're a part of. The individual never gets thrown under the bus. The mind never gets thrown under the bus. The vital never does. It's always just this like, let's work with what is and work with our human potential and come in contact with our infinite soul and have that soul be working with the channels running through nature to be in contact with whatever our mental concepts of the transcendent is, but he makes a lot of those concepts very realizable. So it's so all inclusive that it's almost difficult to talk about an individual thing.
Thank you, Mateo. Marco, do you want to share some of the insights that stood out for you?
Let me pick up on something Mateo just shared, the line from chapter 1, where Sri Aurobindo says that I don't have the exact line, but all problems of consciousness are problems of harmony. And of all the lines in the whole book, I've come back to that because I think that partly explains why one can read Sri Aurobindo and attune to a vibrational frequency and not necessarily understand all the philosophical arguments because they are complex and they're profound. But what I experienced reading the book is that when I would literally physically be in the space of reading, I would attune just by the act of reading the words and feeling them through my body and breathing, circulating energy, like that ritual was a way of attuning with a kind of harmony. It was a way of harmonizing maybe cognitive aspects, questions, that struggle, that aspiration to break out or break through the dilemmas, the impasses, and the crises, that we are experiencing, I'm experiencing through my incarnation, as a human at this time. And that's so cacophonous, that's so dissonant. And, even if one begins, even if one studies a lot, right, there's so many different intelligent perspectives on it, which within themselves may be harmonious, but then between them are dissonant. And so part of what I feel Aurobindo's move is to try to take each perspective, each kind of school of thought, and he does this with nihilism, he does this with illusionism, he does this with materialism, and try to get into that argument and that worldview, that view, as thoroughly as possible, and then transition or shift into the contrary, or into an opposite view or another view, and do that as well. And he does this in the first few chapters, the materialist denial and the whole dialectic between like science and spirit or science and religion. We can find a lot of harmony in science and a lot of harmony in religion or in spirituality or spiritual thought. But then to harmonize those domains takes a whole another kind of work, because they're all points that may be made within them that are contradictory. And so those need to be like, I think part of the divinization is that they need to be like brought into the body, mind, and the life, and worked out, not just in the mind, but worked out on every level. And then those levels themselves, vertically, also are in this involutionary and evolutionary like harmonization. But that's not my typical experience. My typical experience is feeling upset, feeling stressed, feeling, and so the repetition and the ritual is a way of kind of slowly easing out of those patterns into other possible patterns, other possible ways of being with the vast like multiplicity and the vast complexity. And I mean, it all resolves into this vision of unity and diversity in unity, and the one and the all and the one. That's like, that could just be a mental formula. But what I think the yoga is about is turning that mental formula like into a lived reality. And for me, like part of the other insight reading Aurobindo is I have a lot of work to do. We all have a lot of work to do. Or we have a lot of opening to do, to grace and to other intelligences and forces that can work through us. We're just kind of on the bottom, like we're maybe a little bit up the mountain, in this journey. But I really got a sense that, wow, this is a great journey, and it's also an adventure. That was the other thing I got, the sense that like when you get really to the core of it, you have Satchidananda, consciousness being bliss, and so why would we do all this? Why would God create the worlds? Why would we have to go through all of this ordeal, this whole struggle? And I think like what Aurobindo helped me to see more clearly is that in some sense we're having fun. And we're doing it because there's a joy in it, and because it lets us be just a lot more interesting to ourselves than if we were just hanging out in pure emptiness or pure consciousness or something, or in some kind of technological like fairyland that doesn't have depth. And so I still feel like a novice in this adventure and in this journey. I'm a student. I'm learning, and I'm continue to open up like through the poetry now, through Savitri, which was written as a poem. It can be read as well as, and I'm reading it like Mateo, also as a mantra. But why read 1,000 pages of dense philosophical poetry? And in some way, because we enjoy it, and because it helps us then to make our world into a place that's more enjoyable for everybody. And that I think is part of also what's driving activism, is that we don't want to see people suffering pointlessly. Like we sense how great this can be, like how divine the life can be, and we want to extend that and expand that to all beings that we can.
Thank you, Marco. Geoffrey, what were the insights that stood out for you from the book?
Okay, so one of the difficulties I have is I can't separate the life defined from the other readings that I'm doing, because which is more recent, but I can get away with it because all of Aurobindo's writings are really the same writing. I mean, he has one vision and he expresses them differently in each of his books, but it's the same vision. And so whatever I say about the other writings also is relevant about the life defined. So I'm gonna fudge it slightly, but I think I can justify fudging it that way. And I will try and link it back to the life defined when it makes sense to do so. So one of the things that is interesting about the ongoing discussion, but it was also something that came up during the reading of the life divine, is that so Aurobindo wrote all these things not a century ago, but 60 years ago, sort of 50, 60 years ago or so. And so he is kind of an authority. I mean, an established authority, right? But at the same time, the work is unfinished, and it's being modified and rethought and changed as different communities read it, and as our own understandings of what he was saying change over time. And so there's a lot of ongoing discussion inside our groups, and also during the reading of the Life Divine, about nuances of interpretation about what he was saying, but even about our vision of the world. And so this sort of ongoing aspect of the work, I think, is one of the things that keeps me going back to the texts. because they're not written in stone. All of this is an attempt to engage with levels of being that are unfolding in front of us or through us right now, and not simply through. Aurobindo gives us a key, you know, to engaging with this aspect of our lives, but it's a key with a kind of an open-ended nature to it. So that's one of the things I wanted to share about it. Another aspect of the writing, and it's related to the first one. So it's been mentioned that Aurobindo was involved in the political anti-colonial movement, and his own writing. So there's this tendency among the spiritual people in the spiritual world to focus on, you know, there's a certain tendency to focus on individual evolution or individual growth, and to neglect or de-emphasize the social engaged oppression issues, and you know, focus on your own. Even in my own family, my mother was very heavily into a kind of spiritual path, but it was all focused on her own growth, and she wasn't very interested in social movements, and not later on in her life. And yet I think in the world that we're dealing with today, we have to work out both of these at the same time. They're interlinked. And Aurobindo makes that clear throughout his writing, that the engagement with the real world and its real challenges and its darker sides is as key to personal growth as anything else is. And that if you're not engaged on that level, you're never going to get there either. You know, so there's this, and also the importance of the physical. So one of the things that Aurobindo makes clear in his writing is that the physical is absolutely crucial to this whole process as well. So you can't just veg out into some sort of spiritual dimension and neglect the physical, because the physical is rooted in the process of what we're trying to do. So it's another area where I feel different spiritual paths tend to neglect the physical, and Aurobindo embraces it in ways that I find that I'm constantly learning about, because I think we all have this tendency, and he actually says it, that we have this tendency to split off the two paths, one from the other, and that many people have difficulty maintaining both paths at the same time and allowing them to talk to each other. And so that's another aspect to the writing that I find really important. And the third aspect that I wanted to underline is so I know you've got an upcoming question on the transformational aspects, but the life divine is, it presents itself as an expository text. It's explaining something. But none of Aurobindo's writings are expository only. They all are, the way it's written brings you to challenge your own understanding of the world as you read through it. And it engages changes in states of awareness as you read. And I mean, it's part of the reason why I'm reading Savitri, because in a way, this is maybe most evident in Savitri, which is, as an epic poem, poetry has this capacity to engage with changing who we are as we read it. That's what poetry does, right? Even small poems. But Savitri, as an epic poem, does this in many, many different levels at the same time. But even the Life Divine does it, even though it comes across as an expository text. You can't read it as an expository text and stay unchanged. You engage with it, and as you engage with it, it brings about changes in your own understanding and in your own, even your own internal states of mind. So I find that also an aspect of Aurobindo's writing that is joyful, to use Marco's expression.
Can I go ahead?
Go ahead, Mateo.
I just wanted to jump back in really quick because there's so many things going on here, and I want to share something that really helped me being raised Christian with the concept of a transcendent God that created the heavens and the earth. There's 2 chapters: the delight of existence, the problem, and the solution. Early in the first book, and he takes on this is just a solid example for me that helped transform my own way of looking at everything around me. And the question arises, and he addresses it better than I've ever seen. The question of theodicy: how can the justification and claim be made that God is all benevolent and omniscient in the face of suffering and pain? And his answer for me is incredibly transformative, and it's not mental at all. And he directs us toward toward an answer that says that this question can only arise if we have a construct of an Abrahamic God as other. The question actually doesn't arise if there's immanence in the creation. Then the problems are of disharmony. The problems are of the illusion of separativity of consciousness. If God is inside each and every one of us, if we're a spark of that, it's our egos that are causing harm and pain to each other because we're unable to see the entire picture. And then he, in the same argument, he addresses this Buddhist tenet that all life is suffering. And he says, no, all life is bliss. The background is bliss. It's like water to fish. We don't see it, but like our normal state is bliss, and then the pain and suffering is signal to noise and jumps off of the screen, and we're dramatists, and all of a sudden we see that all life is suffering. But he says the background, he kind of points us back to the Ananda of Satchitananda in the higher worlds infusing and having created this world. And then he talks about natural disasters and ethics being a mental state. How can there be a God if an earthquake kills 40,000 people in a clip? And he directs us toward an explanation talking about our ethics being a mental state and being a very human state. Animals aren't ethical, and they don't even think in these terms. And then the final is also revolutionary. The final explanation is revolutionary in that he says pain and suffering are evolutionary spurs. They're essential for the growth and the reaching into the truth. And I'll bring in a line from Savitri that exemplifies this so beautifully. The lines say, pain is the hammer of the gods to break the dead resistance in the mortal's heart, his slow inertia as of living stone. If the heart were not meant to want and weep, the soul would have lain down, content, at ease, and never thought to exceed the human start, and never learned to climb towards the sun. So there's an evolutionary aspect to pain and suffering that he brings in such a solid way. And yeah.
Geoffrey, I wanted to quickly ask you about, especially because you're a scientist, did this change your views on materialism-based science?
It's a good question. Certainly when I read The Life Divine, I had a lot of difficulty with the whole idea of supermind and the sort of involution. The evolution process I don't have much difficulty with, but the involution process I had a lot of difficulty with. And also as a scientist, a bit like what Mateo was talking about, I tend to be very focused on immanent processes. I'm not being very interested in transcendent processes. I wasn't raised Christian, I was raised atheist. And so that colors a lot of my engagements with these things. So when I read The Life Divine, I was sort of reading it with a sort of a half of mind to, okay, I'll dive into this and I'll accept it as I go, but I'll keep my skeptical mind overlooking the process, and I'll preserve that, and I'll keep the two, and I've done, in interaction with each other, and I, in a way, I'm still there, but I think the relationship between the two has shifted. And then there's a certain amount of discussion going on even in the science world, because there are other scientists who are questioning the materialistic basis of the sort of perceived materialistic basis of modern science. And so you have these discussions about philosophical approaches like panpsychism, where you have this idea that consciousness is built in even at the atomic level, and it isn't invented by processes. What processes do is amplify consciousness that's already present in the bottom structures of the universe. And these are philosophical questions. The science doesn't have an answer on those things. So you decide if you're in a materialist philosophy or whether you're in something like panpsychism, and you can then deal with science within that context. So certainly I think I've shifted more towards a panpsychist kind of approach to my understanding of the universe, which I already had kind of because I read Teilhard de Chardin many years ago, and I had always had a kind of sympathy with the new sphere kind of approach that he proposes. So, but that said, I also think, and this is part of the ongoing discussions that I mentioned earlier, that Aurobindo is actually not a transcendentalist. He's not exactly an immanentist either. He just thinks that the universe is bigger than those things, and that you don't decide that it's one thing or the other. It can be all of those things, and so it's this kind of a paradoxical thing where you struggle to figure out how can you deal with a world that is both, with a God, with a divine that is both immanent and transcendent, and it seems to defy logic, but it kind of works even in a kind of a broader vision kind of perspective. And so that's the way I'm dealing with it right now, and still struggling to figure out what that actually means, both in my own life and in the sort of larger questions. So I don't have a final answer on it, but I don't think his vision requires that you reject science. In fact, he built most of his arguments around what was known about science at the time, and he embraced science. He didn't reject it in any way. The whole thing is built on and so I think you can update Aurobindo with what's currently known about science, but it's not a materialist conception of the world. It's something a bit different. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. One quick thing I wanted to ask, has it become harder for you to just deal with like hardcore material-based science, or do you find that narrow-minded when it's only
I don't think I was ever a hardcore materialist scientist. I've been in my own scientific research work, working for the last 20 years to oppose Cartesian body-mind separation approaches. So it's part of the reason why I delved into philosophy in the first place and got into this kind of, I actually got involved in Infinite Conversations, the platform, the online platform, through a discussion of Peter Sloterdijk's work. And Peter Sloterdijk is a modern contemporary philosopher who also rejects Cartesian dualism, along with Deleuze and James and other modern philosophical thinkers. And so that's how I got involved in this group in the first place, because I was already engaged with a process that was looking for alternatives than a purely materialist understanding of the world. And that led me eventually to Aurobindo.
Thank you, Geoffrey. This time I'll start with Mateo. Mateo, when you read this book, did you have any transformational experiences? Did this book influence you in some way in your life after reading this book?
Yes. In some ways, it changed everything. I mean, not this current reading, but my initial contact. Yeah, it's for me, it's so deep. I don't even know how to summarize it, other than it's almost it's inspiration for our deepest and highest potential. So I at this point in my life, I can think of no other reason why I took birth right now was to be to be an active and activated participant in the collaboration of the evolution of human consciousness. And the book for me has those chops.
How about you, Marco? Did this book, did you have any transformational experiences?
I want to say yes, but I can't think of anything specific, because and I think the reason for that is because I had although I would never claim like any kind of scholarly expertise or any kind of comprehensive understanding of Sri Aurobindo's thought. I had a lot of moments reading the book when my feeling was, yeah, I know this. No. And that it was more reminding me, refreshing my memory, or clarifying my vision, or kind of shaking up, like giving my mind in a way, like my mind, my mental apparatus, like a workout, going through all of the arguments, the ways that he extrapolates from ontological premises, like all life is suffering. Okay, well, it's not just that we think about that and then figure out what's the right view. Whole populations of humans like live with that assumption and then find out what it means to live with that assumption, and that feeds back into the cognitive process. And so like materialism is another example that we couldn't just figure it out beforehand. We had to go through the historical process of working, of experiencing like the ramifications of believing that, you know, all this out here is you know, completely dead. It just kind of comes to life in these particular, you know, beings. And you know, I guess the thing to where that pushed me in my thinking was like, I came into this with a bit of a kind of a chip on my shoulder. And I remember at one point in the discussions, I really wanted to go into this question of evil and the question of suffering. And I asked about, or I proposed that there should be a critique of God. And there is, of course, I mean, there has been this critique, but where is this critique in Aurobindo's thought? And I really wanted to, you know, something in me was resisting the idea that the pain and suffering was not just something to be gotten rid of. And that, I mean, like Mateo, that beautiful quote that you also shared a week ago or so, and I've been meaning to ask you for it, like that, if I'm honest with myself, if I didn't suffer and have pain, I would sit and do nothing all day. I would sit and enjoy whatever is happening around me, but I wouldn't really try to do something different, I think. You know, until that like element of dissatisfaction or discontent, and then beyond that into real suffering, and then violence, that, you know, that we initiate these like self-reinforcing like cycles of pathology. Like I have more of an appreciation now for pain and suffering and the value and the like that. I transforming pain into bliss, or finding the bliss at the center of pain. That to me was new. Like, and so I kind of revised my answer and say that on the one hand, it was a reminder of what I already know. And on the other, it was like deconstructing some like presuppositions that I may have had coming into it.
John, did you have any transformational experiences?
Yes, I did. And they were prompted by the questions you posed to the group, which I studied yesterday and reflected upon. And I had the night before a horrific dream, which I'm reluctant to go into because it was so horrific. But I woke up, I went out to my fire escape. I have a beautiful tree, and I communed with the tree. I was sitting in a lotus pose. I was breathing. I did a lot of pranayama. I felt the prana moving through my body, creating a very expansive state. And then I was able to close my eyes and open up. And I got a memory of a very dear friend of mine who died a few years ago. And I was with her when she died. I held her in my arms, an elderly lady in her 90s. And I got into the hospital bed with her, and I put her head on my shoulder. And the memory of that triggered a somatic response. And I felt her presence very strongly. And I was flooded with a deep tenderness for her. And I felt her tenderness for me. And I said, thank you. And I heard her voice, and she said, you're welcome. It was her voice. And so I felt myself, I was anchored in a we-space, imaginally. And then this proceeded to develop further. As I recalled the day before, I saw on YouTube a video of a Black father. He had a video camera, and he was looking down at his newborn baby. And so I look at his Black hands touching his Black baby. I hear his voice. I'm looking through his eyes at his baby, and he's saying the most wonderful things to this little child. So he's in a second person relationship. And I am able to use my imagination through this virtual reality to enter into the weave of a shared reality with this very. Then those were anchors. My beloved friend Beatrice, this video of this Black man expressing his love for his child. With those two anchors, I imaginally worked with George Floyd's murder. And I went into the officers that killed him, George Floyd, his request for mercy, his calling upon his mother. And I'm embodying this. So I found myself deeply resistant. I felt flooded with compassion for George and his family and all of those before him who've been lynched and murdered. But I had a very hard time, a deep resistance, entering into those police officers. And I knew I had to deal with that resistance. And I had my two anchors, and I'm working with this. And this is a process. I'm not there yet, but I think this is I also had to deal with, I was born in Alabama. I was raised in Texas. I was born in a town in Alabama, which I understand had more lynchings than most of the South put together. And in that town where I was a child, I was very aware that that was happening in the relational field that I was in, which was deeply white supremacist, a white body supremacy that was deeply, everyone was embedded in that. So I'm working with that, that I had family members who represented this white body supremacy. And so I open my eyes. It's a beautiful day. I'm looking at the tree swaying in the breeze, and I'm holding all of that tension, hopefully in a creative way. And I'm grounding that, what I've learned from that, is it's a kind of, I'm using virtual reality. I'm using how it can augment the subtle. And we can tell new stories perhaps, or we can be with the old stories in ways that do not re-traumatize us. Because if we're just telling these stories and they're just re-traumatizing us, we're going to go nowhere really fast. But I think if we can be with the stories rather than to deny them or cancel them out or end up in our lotus poses just filled with infinite bliss, I think we need to train our attention, our collective attention. And I think that's what we've been doing many times in many of our conference calls and in this event here, how we can, and I'm posing that this is an out-of-body experience, which I experience, of the third person, because it's first person, it's second person, it's third person. And I believe this is exactly what, or very similar to, or analogous to what Aurobindo was reporting with his experiences of these interdimensional beings when he was in prison and as a terrorist and dealing with that very dark night of the soul. So anyway, I think these are skills and our ability to share attention is extremely important. And we have opportunities now as never before to enter into the weave of complex other beings, both human and non-human. And I believe we are a consortium of intelligences, and I believe Aurobindo would definitely support this idea as we ascend and descend, and also move horizontally as well as vertically through the different disciplines. Whether you're a scientist or an artist, a poet, or a yogi, you can draw upon all of those disciplines and create contexts, new contexts, I think, for holding these tensions in a creative way rather than just re-traumatizing. So that's a direct experience, I think, a case history, perhaps a case study of my ongoing work with Aurobindo. And I believe as someone's said, I think it was Geoffrey, this is an unfinished project. Aurobindo is outlining an unfinished project. And he was definitely a great futurist. So anyway, thank you for giving me a chance to ground that experience in a social reality. If I just written this down in my diary, it would have probably ended up there. But now at least I've shared it with you guys, and you can do with it what you will. I think there's all of us are rehearsing and working this out the best way we can in whatever context we find ourselves in. But I feel not that I've solved a problem by any means, but that I can go out into the mean streets of Manhattan, which are right outside my door, and there are demonstrations all over the place. Potential violence is threatened all over the place. So how can I be with that? I believe I feel a little more fortified and a little more resilient and a little more resourceful rather than getting swept up in any kind of primal fear. Thank you.
Thank you for making that experience part of our realities now. I really appreciate it. Geoffrey, do you want to share if you had any transformational experiences?
Yeah, so I'd have to say that my encounter with Aurobindo as a whole is definitely transformative. And the Life Divine was the opening of that. Now, one of the interesting things, one of the reasons why I say that is a year before I started reading the Life Divine, I had a series of encounters with Hinduism, which I didn't know a lot about originally. And those encounters had already had engendered a certain level of transformation. It's part of my interest in this linking between, or the dialogue between religions. I'd always felt that there should be more dialogue between the religions than there is. I got interested in, I got a kind of intuitive feeling that Hinduism had more to offer than many people seem to. It has a kind of a caricature in the popular understanding of what Hinduism is. And I sort of felt that the reality was maybe much deeper than the caricature would suggest. And so I had started to dig into these experiences, and I had encountered aspects of the experience that spoke to me personally. And reading the Life Divine, so one of the interesting things is during the year, the 8 months or whatever that we were reading it, at one point Mateo organized, because he knows him, so this great Aurobindo scholar, Devashish Banerjee, who came in to speak to the group who were reading it about the Life Divine and the lessons and the insights or whatever that were present, but informed by his scholarly readings and understanding. And very, very interesting man with very, he also has a scientific background or a scientific understanding of things. So he spoke a language that really spoke to me. But it became clear to me at that point that Aurobindo's writings are deeply grounded in his own understanding of the Vedas. It's very Vedic writing. And again, I didn't know anything about the Vedas at the time, but it got me interested. And so since then, I've now been reading the Rig Veda with Mateo and another fellow, Vishnu Aishner, and through Aurobindo's writing about, he wrote a book called The Secret of the Veda, which is, and so what Aurobindo did was, in a way, came up through the Vedic culture because he was Indian, and he instead of thinking of the Vedas as a dogma for religion, he saw it as a kind of a way of understanding the spiritual life, a way of another key, if you like, for understanding the articulation of the spiritual world and how different parts of it speak to each other in a way that most other religions don't quite do. Because the Vedas name all these different gods, and each of the gods represents a different aspect of our spiritual life. The way these gods work together and speak to each other reflect some of these internal dynamics of our own spiritual journey on the world via these texts. And that was Aurobindo's, or that's my understanding of Aurobindo's way of dealing with the Vedas. And the Life Divine in some ways is actually grounded on that understanding. So even though he doesn't necessarily mention specifically the Vedas in particular contexts, if you have that understanding of Aurobindo, you can see the way the Vedas come into the text. And so it is a grounding there. And so when I finished reading The Life Divine with the group, I had a yearning. I had a yearning to read more of Aurobindo. So it was partly why I pushed so hard that we set up a group to read Savitri, which Mateo ended up organizing. I felt that I needed to read more of Aurobindo, and I needed to read more of Aurobindo in his most transformative writings, of which Savitri is possibly, arguably anyway, one of the most transformative of his writings. But also the discussion about the Vedas is also very interesting in his writings about the Vedas, because he does do this rewriting of the Vedas within this larger framework, which I find extremely opening as a kind of a way of, so it's hard to put it down, and it's still an ongoing thing, but my spiritual life has opened up in many, many different ways, and it started with the reading of The Life Divine.
Thank you, Geoffrey. Mateo, I wanted to ask you about, so this book, I think it can be dismissed from both, like from the science world as well as spiritual world. Science, because it does, one could say that there's no like material based evidence or proof for some of the philosophy or theory mentioned in Sri Aurobindo's book. And from spiritual perspective, some Advaita speakers or some spiritual teachers, they tend to deny the individual or deny the world, and it's all about the ultimate and transcendence. They speak about not getting attached to the physical world, or trying to fix the world or make it better. So there's a possibility of dismissal from the spiritual perspective. So where does this work fall? Because it's likely that it could get dismissed by both science and spirituality.
Sri Aurobindo addresses that quite early on in the book, the spiritualist denying the material reality, the materialist denying the spirituality. So if your question is, what's your question specifically?
So how, like, if someone is new to this work, like, this would be neither science or spirituality. How would you kind of introduce this? Like, why would one want to get into it if it's getting criticized by both of these domains?
Well, I mean, the critics will criticize, and that's fine. I don't think it means a hill of beans to Sri Aurobindo. The thing that he's doing, though, very methodically, is integrating those two things. If someone's mind is closed to that process of integration, they're going to bounce right off of it. And I do think we also saw that a little bit in our group. There is a lot of bouncing off of Sri Aurobindo, certainly. I'm sure that there are people in the group that will probably never read Sri Aurobindo again. And that's just the way it is. But how Sri Aurobindo deals with specifically those two things, the spiritual, he's heavily critical of the sadhus in India that just want to escape. He says that no, that's not our raison d'etre. The reason why we came into this world was to be part of the evolutionary arc. So escaping that is missing our entire purpose of being. And then more and more, I don't know. I am a trained scientist, but I can't at all. I'm not an academic. I don't have a PhD in science. I can't speak for the world of science. I just see more and more that that science has to open up to these deeper realms, whether we call them spiritual or not, is another question. I think that there's a tendency to reject the mental construction of what spiritual is within science realms. But again, it's impossible to speak for all of science in this way. Just because more and more there's a deeper understanding of science, and science is really getting deeper into the minutia of the evolution of Prakriti, which is only an aspect of what Sri Aurobindo is doing. Most often with scientists, when I hear the word consciousness, the way in which consciousness is explained in light of Sri Aurobindo's elucidating Sanskrit through spiritual writing, consciousness is manas. From what I hear from scientists talking about consciousness, it's not consciousness in the way that Sri Aurobindo is explaining it. It's sense mind, which is translated as manas in Sanskrit. So it's not. It's like there's a lot of misunderstanding with language, and it takes a deep look at Sri Aurobindo to I think to get it to tease these things out. And that's what he's doing. He's trying to tease these things out for us so that we have better tools to interact with all these beings around us, all these different parts of ourselves, all the myriad worlds that we inhabit. We're not a single being. And so, and Geoffrey brought up the Veda. I do want to add the original title of his essays on the Isha Upanishad was The Life Divine. So this work is incredibly anchored in the Upanishads, and then there's Vedic infusion throughout. Almost a lot of the chapters are started with Vedic quotes that reflect the topic of the chapter that he's working with. There's all these linchpins. Also, there's these keystones that kind of that tie all these things together with each chapter. That would take a lot of discussion to get into, and I'm happy to continue on further with more things if you want, but that's probably good for now. To answer the question, I direct anyone that wants to look deeply at it to those two chapters, the spiritualist denial of the material realm. Let me just quote the chapters in case anyone is interested. The two negations, chapters 2 and 3, the two negations, the materialist denial, and the chapter 3, the two negations, the refusal of the ascetic.
Thank you, Mateo. Marco, did you find it challenging when you were first reading this book that maybe this philosophy is just another complex idea created by the mind? Because mind has that.
No, I didn't. Because I like that kind of thing. Like I like reading this kind of work, and I was, as I mentioned earlier, first learned of Sri Aurobindo through Ken Wilber, who's also known for creating meta-theoretical or meta-theoretical systems. But I actually wanted to, if I may, because I don't have too much time, and I wanted to answer rather a different question that you had previously asked relating to technology and consciousness, because this is a topic that came up in the readings, but it's also come up, and it's not even only come up, but it's in certain, I think, ways driven some of what we've been doing as a group.
Yes.
And I mean, the question of like what is the future of human look like is one of the key ones that Sri Aurobindo, I think, is pointing us to, that we're in a transitional phase or stage, and something is coming beyond us, and we're part of that something. We're feeding into that something, and that something is us, but it's also not only human. So as we understand humanity to date, which is informed by all of our religious traditions, our scientific traditions, and so on. So the question that is, what is the role, or what is the what is the role of technology in that? Because there are a whole bunch of people who think that really it's technology that's evolving, and humans are serving the evolution of this technological kind of future intelligence, and that it's not about us ourselves evolving. It's about us evolving something else, and then that thing being the supermind. And I remember watching a video. It was a philosopher from CIIS, California Institute of Integral Studies. I don't remember the person's name, but he's using the analogy of a spider which casts a web. And the spider web it's not quite identical with the spider, because the web could fall away and the spider could go away and make another web, but it's an extension of that spider. And when an insect lands on the web, the spider senses that insect through these extensions. And in a way, you could see that web as the technology that the spider uses to extend its nervous system in order to be able to perceive a field that is wider than its particular body. So technology and consciousness, I think, are deeply intertwined. And when I began doing this kind of thing, like meeting with other people and taking deep dives into books, I was first using Facebook and the other social media. And I really had amazing, I was seeing that there were some just beautiful people. Like, the world is full of beautiful people, and that they had a lot of interesting things to say, and that there were deep discussions happening, like on my Facebook feed, Facebook groups, etc. But I noticed that I would always feel shitty, even though I like the people and like what we were talking about. Just through my use of the technology, I felt like my consciousness was being diminished. And on the other hand, that web that we've created with the internet is an extension of our nervous systems. So if my experience of these intersubjective depth explorations with other people are happening mediated by this extended nervous system that we call the internet, which is supported by our whole global technological infrastructure, then if we pay attention to how we use the technology and what it's being used for, that should support a different kind of consciousness. That should allow for us to be able to commune with each other, but not to feel depleted and scattered and distracted and stressed and kind of even worse off from where we began in certain ways. You know, as we've been seeing how, you know, these platforms have become such a, you know, catalyst in the disintegration of, a catalyst in good and bad ways. But I wanted to ask, like, how can we kind of piece together like technologies in order to support better consciousness, more open consciousness, more authentic consciousness? And that's what this is about. I mean, I'm not myself a programmer or designer or anything, but what I just through, you know, thinking about studying this is realized is that all, you know, the other platforms, these centralized commercial platforms, they're kind of like leeches on our awareness. They're using the fact that they provide a service for us to interact with each other, and then they're siphoning off, you know, all of our attentional energy, all of our human energy. They're turning it into huge profits, which then they're reinvesting in growing this, you know, this AI that may not serve our interests really. But there are a whole lot of people who are working on technologies that are doing so in more ethical ways, more integral ways, more conscientious ways, more open ways. And if we could bring together some more of an ensemble of open technologies that are not controlled by, you know, small group of people who are extracting all the wealth out of our minds, you know, and of course, you know, then we could feed that back in to creating an infrastructure for a kind of supermind on Earth. I don't think we're going to get there on Facebook. You know, I think we need to have a distributed web of open communication technologies, which is our extended nervous system, that allows us to harmonize all of the different conflicting and traumatic, post-traumatic, and current traumatic experiences that we're having as a species. So I really, you know, I'm really thrilled that you reached out to talk with us, because, you know, you're somebody who's also trying to use this technology to further, I think, a deep end, which is this realization, this evolution of consciousness, and that becoming transformative. Like when John talked about inhabiting the perspectives of, you know, of George Floyd, of the police, of the protesters, of the reactionaries. You know, one of the illusions that this technological worldview can give us is that that's not happening to us. There's this screen in front of us. It's a representation of something that's happening to somebody else somewhere else. But if we bring the technological dimension together with the conscious dimension, we realize that no, that is happening to us, and we're perceiving it through this web, and we're feeling it through this web together. And then we could kind of shift the direction of how that nervous system is being operated. I think that's what we have to do, and it's like life or death for our species, and for the, you know, for this iteration of the grand adventure and the experiment in you know, conscious life on a planet. So I just want to thank you for this. I hope that this is only the beginning of more to come. I have to exit at this time, but I would, if you continue the conversation, I will eagerly listen, and I hope that we'll get to continue in the near future.
Definitely. Thank you so much. And I want to continue on this particular conversation, hopefully in a separate segment, because there is so much to address in that. But thanks for a brief introduction to that topic.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Nice being with you, Marco.
Bye-bye, Marco.
John. See you, Mateo. See you, Geoffrey. You as well, as always.
John, I think I would like to ask you about, I want to continue what Marco said and ask you about your take on what's happening with the current technology versus trying to grow that within our, like through our own inner consciousness. Where do you see that those two things growing?
Thank you very much for that question. It's a great research question. I think we're all engaged in this. And I think I really appreciate what was just said. I think that the virtual reality that's brought to us through these flat screens, or if we use some sort of device, we can use the technology, but the technology should not use us. And I think this is something we need to discriminate. And I think Banerjee, many of us had a conversation with Banerjee about Aurobindo, and he's definitely a student of the technology. And he said, if you explore this technology, you will eventually come into relationship with the shadow of the technology. And I've had that experience, and it's a very harrowing experience. It's like it's a living being, and it's drawing upon us, and it's turning us into zombies if we allow that to happen. By offloading our moral dilemmas and impasses and our visionary and our conflicts, if we offload those dilemmas and impasses and conflicts onto the abiotic, the algorithmic, we're doomed. And I suggest, though, that it isn't, I'm not wanting to dismiss the uses, which are enormously educational. And I just gave that example of being able to step into the embodied sense of a Black man with a Black child, and seeing through his eyes, hearing through his ears, feeling. That, I think, is an excellent use of contacting the affective zones and a shared reality that's extremely healthy. And I think it can open us up and expand us. And I don't have any children and I don't have any pets, but with my dear friend Beatrice, who had dementia, and I was taking care of her, I would turn on my laptop and I would show her YouTubes of little kids, little babies. And would go into ecstasy because she loved babies. And when she was very ill and dying, I would turn on the YouTube and we would look at ballet. We would look at dance because she was a dancer, and a very fine ballroom dancer, professional quality dancer. And so I found the things that she loved, and I found, Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers and the Boy Show Ballet. She would spend hours enraptured by that. And I felt it was reactivating something in her own nervous system. So it's like, how do we use this technology? It can be extremely educational and beneficial, and it can open our nervous systems up into social engagements, or it can overwhelm us and shut us down and re-traumatize us and distract our attention. So at the end of the day, we've spent too much time in mindless chatter, distractions, compelling us to go on shopping sprees and that kind of thing, and nefarious forces that are trying to manipulate and harvest our attention. I think that's what's so fascinating about this lockdown, and how we've, many of us are using this technology to create community as we're doing now, and trying to create a new narrative, because I think the narratives, we're having a crisis of narrative right now. So we need to use our imaginations in really healthy and creative ways, rather than in destructive and re-traumatizing this. So I'm very hopeful that we can use AI for our human purposes and for development. And our subtle system is so powerful. The analog is so much more powerful than the digital will ever be. But I don't think that should stop us from using the digital and developing it in creative ways, because it can augment the subtle and the imaginal, but it will never replace it. So that's why I think our moral imaginations are more needed now than ever. And a computer, a robot, will never be able to do what I was doing out on my fire escape, as I communed with those spiritual anchors and brought that intensity into this other very dark area, which I was afraid to look at. but I'm not finished yet. This is an ongoing process. And I think collectively, we're all dealing with our imaginations, our social imaginations. And how can we do this at our best? And I think this is a great place to practice. And I thank you so much, Suma, for making this happen. And I so much enjoyed so many of your interviews and your still presence and your kindness and your ability to listen and let everybody just let it all hang out. I think that's great. Thank you so much.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was on mute. That was quite insightful. Thank you for sharing that, John. Geoffrey, do you want to give your input on AI, the technological progress that's happening through AI versus the potential of progress that could happen through consciousness?
I guess. It's a bit of a Pandora's box kind of thing. So one of the things I should say before from the get-go is that even though I'm a scientist and I've done some of my research has actually been contributed to artificial intelligence research, I am not a proponent of strong AI, and I don't. And I like Johnny and Mateo, I think I don't buy into this idea that AI is going to create this mental entity. I don't think it works that way. I don't think the universe works that way. I think that the physical grounding is a necessary part of any functional mental intelligence. It's based on the Cartesian fallacy. This idea that you can separate mind from body is a Cartesian idea, and it's a fallacy. And so if you try to build things that way, it's just never going to work. That said, there are things that one can do with that kind of approach, and it is generating tools that can be used in all sorts of circumstances. So I'm not arguing against AI as a tool-based initiative to develop more advanced tools for doing different things. It's just that I don't buy into this sort of super mental entity that the AI folks seem to believe they're headed for. I just don't think that's going to happen. And in relation to, so there's an argument, in a way, it's an argument that interests me, the argument about whether or not you could do technologically things that the divine already does, in a way, right? So can you use technology to take over some of the God functions? This is it's a question, and it's certainly one that interests a lot of people right now. And of course there are ethical issues around it too. Would you want to? So that's certainly one question. But maybe so I don't know what the answer is to the question. Some of my science fiction writing deals with the question. But I think again, it's, the argument is you don't want to go there because it's dangerous, because, lots of things in science were announced as being dangerous, but we went there anyway. It's not a question of danger exactly. But not in any sort of, I don't know, tangible physical way, I guess. But there are dangers of neglecting the physical grounding of what it is to have a human experience. And so, and this is the technology and the shadow side of technology that we have right now. So even the lockdown and the screens, I mean, half my life right now is spent sitting at a screen talking to people on the screen. But I am hyper aware when I do that my cognitive machinery, my cognitive functions in body are, what I'm doing is I'm hyperstimulating my mental imagery because there's no physical grounding of it. I'm not walking around and doing exercise while I'm talking to people. I'm sitting in a chair, and so all my mental imagery is engaged, but there's no physical counterpart to it, and there's a price to be paid for that. And in the long term, you know, we're going to lose out if we continue to do that. We have to. So I've started a vigorous exercise program in the last 2 months in order to try and counter some of the sort of passiveness that has arisen during the lockdown period. And I think, you know, maybe the way forward in terms of the technology is to find ways to engage the full human being through, you know, in relation to the technology, rather than use the technology to focus on only a very small part of what it is to be human. And if there's a way forward in terms of bringing the technology and these kinds of quests together, it's to ensure that one engages the full human being, not just a part. I'm not sure that I have a lot more to say about that. But,
Thank you, Geoffrey. Mateo, what's your take on evolution using AI and technology versus evolution of consciousness?
I'll just start by saying I've really resonated with everything that John and Geoffrey just shared, and Marco too. But the thing, there's something about, I just went through an interesting process that I'd like to share. So Marco shared something that I didn't quite agree with, right? That technology will be, and this speaks to a number of things. I think he said something like technology will be the way in which Supermind manifests, or something like that. But this kind of speaks to what's happening right here, and my dislike for Facebook. Marco said something, I disagree, Marco's not here anymore. All of a sudden I could talk about why I disagreed, but we'll be engaged in what I call ping pong monologue, which is what Facebook does and what texting does. There's a ping pong monologue, and it's not what's happening. Dear Marco, I wish that he were here to discuss this, so I won't go further into it, but it's an example of what we're doing differently. Is Suma is mediating or facilitating a circle discussion. It's going around and around and building up energy, and it's what I experienced a lot with our Life Divine group, and most acutely with a recent group that I participated in on Infinite Conversations regarding the coronavirus. There was just this like building and moving around and around. There was no established circle, and it was just like things were flowing out because of us using the technology and the tool to connect and to deepen our experience and to come in contact with each other in a meaningful way. And then Geoffrey brings up the whole-bodied human, and I'm like, you all are on screens, and I've been living here alone for 3.5 months with my dogs, and I need a hug. And we can't hug each other. Like, I really need a damn hug. And I haven't hugged another human being in months. We need touch. There's something, there is something that's missing here. And I think John said the analog can never be replaced by the digital. I see the digital as a tool for connectivity, but there's no replacing biological material infused with mind, infused with intuition, There's no a computer. A computer won't be able to do this. These technological systems are a very low level reflection of our potential to be operating in the Akashic field, an extremely low level. I don't even think we can conceive of our potential in relation to this if we're thinking that technology is some high level advancement. I just don't see it that way. And I'm all for the evolution of Prakriti and consciousness. We have to, I had an experience yesterday that stopped me, and it stopped me in the road, quite literally. The mailman drove by, and he's like, holy shit, Mateo, I have to thank you. I ordered Amazon, and he dropped off my Amazon, was blowing by me on the road. He's like, I have to thank you. Believe me, we're watching. You've ordered Amazon 3 times in the last 3 months. And I said, I know, and I'm not judging anyone. We're all in different places. I said, I know, Elliot, you know what? Fuck Amazon. And I have neighbors on the road that are ordering, they have Amazon deliveries twice a day. And we're not set up for what's going on right now. And I asked him, is the USPS going to survive the Trump administration? And he said, I love that question, but that's not the question. We're not surviving the coronavirus because we can't run at this rate. This separativity that's happening right now, there's a part of us that's withering away and in need of something that I hope will emerge. This John bringing George Floyd and the processes around George Floyd reminds me of a Sri Aurobindo aphorism where he turns that cliche, there but by the grace of God go I. Sri Aurobindo brings in it's not just individual, it's not just immanent consciousness and transcendent consciousness that he brings in. There's cosmic consciousness. And Sri Aurobindo says, there by the grace of God go I as George Floyd, as the cop kneeling on his neck, as my racist grandmother, as my parents who grew up in wrecked homes because no one could fit into these boxes that people wanted to put everyone else in, the family of violence that we're all wrestling with right now. And I just see everything. I see things changing in a way that the more divisiveness that we're confronted with right now, the more the heart energy is coming forward and connecting people and bringing things into conversation that we were 10 years ago, the average person might have been afraid to approach. And here we are utilizing technology to deepen our collective growth. And I think it's really beautiful. And I appreciate what goes on with these circles.
My one follow-up question for you, Mateo, on that is, one thing that comes up for me when I compare progress through technology versus progress through consciousness is that technology, one advantage I see over there is it's consistent. It's like the results are repeatable. It's always available when you access it. Versus consciousness, like some of these experiences, they are not consistent. Like it's kind of like you have to depend on the universe to have those experiences. And sometimes they happen, sometimes they may not happen. That's one thing that I always question, like, why are they not consistent? And that's one edge I feel like technology has over consciousness, where and I don't know, maybe that will change in future as our consciousness evolves. Maybe we would be able to consistently access some of these realms. So that's my question. Like, why, if consciousness is starting to develop, why is it not consistent? Why do we have to depend on universe to?
It's not a machine. You can't, it doesn't turn on and turn off, right? The reproducibility, like any biologist that's doing any experimentation, one of the main struggles is reproducibility. So all biological experiments are run off of statistics and p-values, probabilities, and things like that. We're so far from understanding how to reproduce these access, deeper and wider access to higher infused states of consciousness. But it's undeniable that that yogic consciousness has effects both inward and outward, and those they're just there's a lot of. There is a lot of detail. I don't want to say that it's not reproducible, because it actually is. It's just it takes a Herculean effort to. I don't want to use the word purification in the sense of evoking puritanical values, but there's a lot in there's a lot in our field that actually needs to be rejected to get the channels clear of junk. And then even if I can get some channels in my individual field clear of falsehood and clear of ignorance, the entire realm of the subconscious and the collective consciousness lies in front of me. And so the infinite is too complex. The machines are part of an infinite. I turn the computer on 1,000,000 times out of 999,900. It turns on and runs like it should run, but it's a machine. It's not conscious. It's not consciousness other than being built from material that is conscious and has consciousness as background. So maybe the reproducibility is illusory in that there is a permanence in the progression and the development of the technology in the evolution of Prakriti, but it might not be producible ever in the way that it's forming right now. And how many manifestations have we actually been through? Our human concept of time is ridiculous. So there's the timeline that the anthropologists talk about. Who says that this is even the first expansion of the universe? Well, there's spiritual masters that say we're in the 7th, and that these are 15 billion years, solar Earth years of contraction and expansion. We're talking about the realm of the infinite. So what's actually reproducible here? I don't know. Everything seems unique, and everything seems like there's such a familiarity with it that it's all happened before in a different way, and it's unfolding now for our particular for our particular collaboration with it, our unique individual collaboration with it.
What are your thoughts on that, John? Why do you think some of these experiences are not consistent? Is it maybe because we are not mature enough to have those consistent experiences?
I think in my case that's true. I had many expansive, extraordinary. You mentioned if you've had any experiences of the Supermind, do you make that public? I think that was one of your questions. I love that question. You probably should keep it a secret, but I think that Aurobindo didn't, and I think that I think now is not the time to keep this stuff secret or sweep it under the rug, or people think I'm crazy, I'm not going to go that way. I think it's a certain amount of risk, and I'm not saying there are any rules or regulations here. I think the timing has to be right. because if you want to communicate to another person your experiences, you need to do it in a respectful way, in a way that doesn't violate their beliefs. If it does, you want to be sure that they're anchored in some sort of safety before you go that way, if it's that compelling. I've had many times, I've had telepathic experiences, I've had precognitive experiences. I have, with horror, experienced a precognitive flash. I delivered a message to a person about what was given to me. And to my horror, it actually happened. So I got very confused. So why in the world was that given to me if it had no impact whatsoever when I shared the message? So but I think out of those traumas, certain kinds of those kind of capacities, once you exercise them, you can reflect upon them, and it may take a whole lifetime to unpack them. But I did have some of those experiences that I would say, I'm not calling it supermind, I'm calling it superminding. It's a process, it's a verb, it's an activity, rather than keeping it in some frozen absolute somewhere out there. It's, at any rate, I think it has a lot to do with maturity. And I've often found myself, when everything's going really well and I'm really proud of myself, oh wow, I did my yoga today and I meditated and I did some good deeds, I'm flying high. And then usually I'm setting myself up for a nightmare or something awful happens. So I'm very mindful of that, that sometimes the more expansive certain experiences are, the universe gives you something that you can't handle yet. And you go, oh, I thought I was going to get some reward for all of my hard work. No, well, this is your reward. You're getting something that you can't lift yet. So I think it's, you know, you have physical muscles you work out at the gym, and you have these psychic muscles as well you need to work out. And sometimes we blow a fuse because there's just too much energy coming through our system, and it can blow a fuse. And I think Aurobindo references the Kundalini. And of course, his process was moving from the higher centers into the physical. My experience of Kundalini was from the bottom up, which is much more of a shamanic, tantric process that most people do not recommend because it can be very, very fragmenting, as it was in my case. But I didn't have much of a choice. I knew nothing about it. I was just having these incredibly energetic explosions that were happening in my nervous system, and my nervous system settled down. And then all of a sudden I started to read about this stuff, and there are many different theories about it. There's nothing conclusive, but those who have these experiences often rely upon mythic categories that they have a traditional response to. But I think we're I don't think we have I don't think the maps are very adequate right now to what we're going through. And I think many of us maybe our systems are being flooded with too much energy that we don't know how to ground. So I feel like that's my responsibility, is to be sure I'm using the technology, putting it aside, allowing myself to get bored. And the interesting thing is, if I stay with that boredom long enough, it becomes interesting, you know? And I find out, oh, underneath that boredom, there's a lot of bliss I'm not giving attention to, which the flat screen never gives me. But I do think that opportunities like this for us to come together, to engage our social systems, you know, looking into each other's eyes, hearing the voice, sensing the presence of the other person, that this has a benefit. And when this episode is over, I will go out into the streets, and I know that there will be something nourishing about this space and your presences that will continue with me. That's why I do these enter into these public spaces and take the risks that we're taking, talking about this stuff, which many consider taboo. They take this stuff off the table, and that makes their world much easier, because then they can stay hardcore materialists or maintain their physicalist explanations for everything that were just, you know, meatware. And I think those exaggerated tendencies in our culture are being I think these anomalous experiences can have a frightening aspect to them. But once we ground and we understand that there's enormous benefits that come from these experiences when we integrate them, and find communities that we can, that will allow us to explore this. And I think there's this kind of self-correction that happens. So if there's anything like some shadow work that needs to be done, or some narcissistic issues that need to be explored, that will happen in our relationships with one another. But you do have to find a community of competent people, because if you expose yourself to the wrong kind of group, the wrong kind of audience, it can just re-traumatize you. So thank you for that question. I'm still working on that myself.
I'm feeling really quick, and this is just my feeling, that the circle is slightly out of balance, because we haven't heard from Suma, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but what do you think of this question about consciousness, technology, everything that we're talking about?
I think I still consider myself as kind of new into this realm, and I'm going with my instinct and intuition. My intuition is that I think it will take some kind of maturity to be able to access, to be able to open up our consciousness to the degree of Supermind, because maybe it's gently shown to us so that we slowly start opening up and start adjusting our nervous system to those possibilities. If it's all opened up too quickly, I think it's too much for a person to handle. So that's my guess, that maybe as you mature, as you're open to more and more realms, it will slowly and gently start opening up. And I also feel like some of these things are not just scientific, they are also artistic. It opens up in a very artistic way. It's not like a hardcore technology. Some of these experiences have stories and a poetic touch to it. So it's a mix of science and art. That's my intuition. I don't know for sure. Geoffrey, what do you think? Like, we were talking about how with regular technology, things are consistent and reproducible, whereas trying to access this through Supermind or consciousness experiences, it's not always consistent. Like some of these experiences happen randomly. So,
like my system crashing when you were raising the question. One of my slogans is the first right of a human being is to be inconsistent, because I think we live in a tyranny of consistency. People want everything to be consistent with everything else, and human beings are fundamentally inconsistent. It's built into our nature. So AI is consistent. It's all algorithms, and algorithms are by nature consistent. So it's one of the, in fact, I'm working on a scholarly text with a collaborator colleague on the issue of singularity, not the technological singularity, but the singularities that are present in our everyday lives, because human beings are built out of singularity. Singularity in the sense of unpredictability. And algorithms are not. They are predictable from A to Z. That's what their nature is. And so it's another reason why I'm not a strong AI proponent, because I think AI is going to has trouble dealing with singularity. Even the fact that they talk about the technological singularity is an indication that they have trouble with singularity. Whereas we humans, we deal with singularity every day of our lives, and not only once in a day, but dozens, sometimes hundreds of times in a day. Just reaching for a glass of water is an exercise in singularity, because there are all sorts of what am I saying? There are processual blocks in the process that science knows about, but science tends to brush those to one side because it didn't. So, you know, the process of reaching for your glass of water is scientifically considered to be more or less a solved problem. But when you actually look at the science, there are these gaps in it, and they have to do with the unpredictability of the way the body works. And so it's not such a solved problem. And most of our lives are built out of these things that are not consistent or not necessarily consistent. So I think one should be surprised at consistency rather than surprised at inconsistency. And regarding the questions at the end of your list of questions, I don't think of Supermind as a thing. I notice this sort of a Supermind. I don't necessarily think of Supermind as an a or even as a the. I think of Supermind as Supermind without the article. It's this, you know, it's this idea of, I mean, I grew up, part of one of my traditions is Quakerism, and Quakers are organized around this idea of, which is in the Bible, that wherever two or three are gathered in my name, there I am. So this idea that God is in all of us. Well, that's, for me, Supermind. Supermind is this entity, this process. I like John's idea of superminding, this process that is embedded in all of us and not necessarily articulatable as a single, as a thing, right? To come back to my earlier discussion about the relationship between technology and the divine, the issue is if you think you can replace the divine with the technology, you're on the wrong path. What you need to be looking at is, how can I enhance my humanness, my humanity, the things that make me human, and integrate technology in that process of enhancing myself, but not with this idea of replacing the human with something else. This is to me a nonsensical as a process.
I could add something to that. Suma, is it okay? Okay. I was just challenging my own thinking and just about personal experiences and the imaginal and our imaginative capacities, and how they often get channeled in a narrow external focus, and we aren't paying attention to the peripheral. And this is, of course, exaggerated by our use of flat screens. And about the overindulgence, perhaps, in the visual and the out of balance of the kinesthetic and the auditory. I remember I saw something on ketamine therapy, a psychiatrist talking about ketamine. And it was very interesting because it's used now therapeutically. A lot of people with severe depression have been alleviated by the use of ketamine. And I thought that's very curious because I took that drug. It used to be a very popular drug in the the underground culture that I was a part of. And I did it once or maybe twice. And it was really interesting because I'd had many years of meditation. And I realized for other people, that state was very unusual to them and an altered state. And I experienced it as like, oh yeah, I've been here before. I've done so much meditation. But I realized that when I heard that this was used as a therapy, I thought, yeah, well, I can just go into a light trance and remember that state because it's already, my nervous system is adept at reactivating that experience. And I also heard about a woman who had lupus, an autoimmune disease, and the drug that she was using to correct that condition was no longer useful, or actually became toxic at a certain point. So someone had a brilliant idea. A hypnotherapist was employed to put her into a trance and to communicate directly to her immune system, and letting the immune system know that we're giving her this drug that supports her well-being. And of course, they weren't giving her that drug. They were giving her some sort of placebo or something, or sugar water or whatever. But her system responded robustly, as if she was getting the benefits from the drug. But actually, she was just being put into a trance state, and her nervous system was invited to remember the benefits of receiving this drug. So I'm just saying these are just examples, a personal example of using a drug, and this example of a therapeutic drug being used, and how our nervous systems are so incredibly complex. So for us to think that technology is going to improve or replace this incredible nervous system is absurd, because we already are technology. This is a portal. The body is a portal, and it's connected to multiple realities, and can engage many different kinds of affects. Just as I expressed earlier with my meditation and working with trance and working with memory and working with other people's experience, how I can bring together different kinds of emotions. These are, I believe, social emotions, but that all of us are able to do this. And it is magical, but it's not just magical. I think cognitive psychologists are working with this too. So I think there's something that can happen between virtual reality, but I think it augments what's happening in the subtle and the vital. It does not and never will replace or become more sophisticated man. And I'm delighted by this. I saw one young man, he uses those goggles to study like 4D and 5D objects moving. And he, as a dancer, is able to use his body to get in sync with that imagery. So he can take off the goggles, and he now has that in his nervous system, that experience. And he does what he calls liquid dancing. And it's a very beautiful set of movements and routines. And they have communities of people who do this. So I think that's an excellent use of a virtual reality moving into the psyche and the soma of a dancer, creating a kind of meta dance, if you will. So I think these are just, we're really at the beginning, I think, of a new wave of our ability to use our imaginations in healthy ways. And I think we're talking about the creativity of creativity. We're changing how we change. And can we do this mindfully and compassionately and ecologically? Well, we don't know yet. But I think that this experiment today, I think is an occasion where we're putting all of this out on the table and letting it reorganize as it will. Because I think that I think it's just really important that we use the circling metaphor that you brought up earlier about that we're not really in a circle, but we can imagine that we're in a circle. And I think that's a very old, ancient shape, the mandala shape, that we can all draw upon. And we can come into the center of the circle, and then we can go back out into the periphery of the circle, and we can be very flexible in how we share our attention, because I think our greatest breakthroughs happen as we are adept at sharing attention. And our ancestors did this when they created the spear, bow and arrow, the trap. And later on, we went from the harpsichord to the piano, to the grand piano. I think these are all technologies, and they come out of our shared attention, and they can improve enormously, not just our survival, but our capacities for using our imaginations and living ecologically. But there's always a high risk. So anyway, thank you for this opportunity once again. It's very stimulating for me.
I wanted to ask each of you about, and we briefly talked about this with John. if someone does, and for this question, I'm going to refer to this as a supermind. I know it's a wrong way to refer to it, but just so that I'm able to explain what I'm trying to ask. If someone does develop their consciousness from mind to a supermind level, and they are able to do a lot of things that they couldn't do before, would such an individual, is it practical for that person to share that with the public? Are we ready as a society to see that level of evolution? I'll start with Geoffrey first.
I'll be right back in a jiffy.
I don't know. A little bit. I mean, I think if anybody had that level of understanding of the world, it would have been it was Aurobindo, and clearly his sharing his ideas about the other dimensions of the world and these different levels was useful. You know, it was useful to everybody for him to write this out. So I think sharing this kind of understanding to a broader community is of use. I'm not sure that the world is really ready to receive the information. That's maybe the other side of it. I mean, as it has been mentioned a few times, there is a community that is interested in what Aurobindo was saying, but of course it's a very small community compared to the whole population of humanity. And so I don't, although again, I'm somebody who believes that even a small group of people can have a large impact on the world. And so again, I think that even what we're doing here may have ripples that propagate out. I think the ripple effect is of relevance, but I think the more people that are able to attain higher levels of consciousness are, it's better for humanity as a whole. But I think we're still a long way from being able to harness as a planetary population, to be able to harness those kinds of energies.
What do you think, Mateo? Would it create more problems if someone comes out and shares their supermind abilities?
I'd almost like to take the supermind out of this and talk about a little more low-level things that we can talk about here. And Sri Aurobindo addressed the gap in Swami Vivekananda did not want to address cities. Yogic cities are powers that develop as yogic practice becomes more and more mature. There's certain powers that come into being. This is, I think, evident to anyone that's having spiritual experiences. There's a lot that starts manifesting. So Sri Aurobindo said in a really early essay, I think it was called City. It's in Essays Divine and Human. He's basically encouraging people to not be afraid of these powers that develop from yogic practice. As being part, so I don't think there's any harm in that. I think that the harm is in the ego self-aggrandizing these things, sort of a glamorization of these states as if I'm special, if I've had this experience type thing. Okay, so that's me keeping it kind of on a low level. And then being part of the global integral yoga community, the integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, I can say I don't think I know anyone that is making any claim along these lines. I think the deeper we look into what Sri Aurobindo was describing as the supermind, it's kind of far beyond any conception of words. It gets close with things like Geoffrey, what he shared as singularity. If I'm understanding singularity correct, as a point where the finite is approaching the infinite. In a scientific concept, space and time break down around that point. So that might be the closest, maybe. I mean, Sri Aurobindo goes deep into the explanation of what supermind is, but he still doesn't talk about what that looks like. He's kind of careful around that. And then there's a lot from what gets called the Mother's Agenda, which is a 13-volume set of recorded talks between her and a sadhak. The actual title of that is the agenda of the supramental action upon earth. So if going back to the definition of supramental being closer to that of the point where the finite and the infinite are touching, whether it's collapsing down to the 0 point, which kind of gets called the inconscient in Sri Aurobindo's realm, or expanding out to the point of the infinite, which gets called the superconscient in Sri Aurobindo's languaging, to make the claim. So again, there's different levels. We're in transition. If it can be accepted that humans are a transitional being and that we're in the process of evolution, there's different stages to get to what Sri Aurobindo called a supramental being. Like they in their later writings, much later than the Life Divine, they differentiated between these states. And Sri Aurobindo and the mother both said that their conception of the supermind was very different than what it was when the Life Divine was written. And the Life Divine was also revised multiple times. It's a complex thing, Suma, and I'm really hesitant of anyone glamorizing these states or aggrandizing themselves around these states. And then there's people that have had real authentic realizations that they can then share and help other people with, and then bringing it back to more concepts that Sri Aurobindo helped me with personally in transformation is the concept of swabhava and swadharma, which brings in the uniqueness of each individual as part of this whole, as a spark. We're all sparks of this larger flame, and we have our own unique work to do in the world, and we have our own unique reasons for coming into being, and that can't be taught. Even if someone says, "I am a supramental being," like fine, fantastic. How do you? It can't be taught with another being that's an infinite being. How can that process and path be transferred to another organic being that's in their unique process of flowering?
Thank you, Mateo. John, you briefly talked about it. Can you expand a little bit more on if an individual does develop to a supermind consciousness, is it advisable to share that in public?
Well, I think there's the ordinary, the non-ordinary, altered states of consciousness. Altered compared to what? I think these are all comparisons and contrasts. And I think this is the way consciousness evolves in each of us, is through contrast and comparison. And and there is this question about the ego, and I feel like this is maybe a little controversial, but I think the personal pronoun I is very important. And I feel like some practitioners think it's important to dissolve that in this oceanic bliss. And I believe that the I is given to us. It's biological, it's subtle, and it's vital. And it creates conditions for the other, for the we. So I believe that the I, the we, and the it, third person orientation, can interpenetrate in some interesting ways, in creative ways. So I'm not for getting rid of the ego. I am for modifying the ego and releasing our identity as the ego, but we want to preserve the function of the ego. And that's when you have an I, a personal pronoun I, that is located in a center, then you can open to the field of all possibilities safely. If you don't have that, and you open to the field of all possibilities, you're in trouble. So I believe we need to respect the traditions, because many of them are, those prohibitions are legitimate, but we also shouldn't go too far in another direction, because grandiosity is inevitable. It's going to happen to all of us, and we don't need to be afraid of it. Grandiosity, and I think this text in some ways is full of it. Aurobindo, he lets out all the stops, and it's like a Bach organ, it's just a really ecstatic and powerful expression. So I don't think we should try to re-traumatize ourselves and put the lid on it to please or placate so-called spiritual authorities who, tisk, 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 don't go that way. Because we need to learn for ourselves, and then if we get overwhelmed by something or we get burned by something, we dust ourselves up and get back up and reorganize. And we learn something from that. So I think the ego can be a friend, and the ego can be a collaborator, and ultimately a servant. And I am in the world, but I am not of the world. But I am in the world, and I am for the world. I think this is very important for us, that once we have these extraordinary experiences, that we can return to the ordinary and function more effectively than we would have if we hadn't had these experiences. But if they become a fascination and are indulged in, yes, I do think there's a dark side to that. And there are prohibitions against certain kinds of experiments. But I also think of myself as a laboratory, and I'm not the only one I am being studied as well. I remember in the 90s, I had a lucid dream, and in the lucid dream, my dream body was in this, looked like a laboratory, and there were lots of computers there. And I said, hello, is there anyone here? Can someone help me? Can someone teach me something? I was looking for a teacher, obviously a guide of some kind. And a man appeared in a white lab coat. And he said, well, we can't teach you anything, but you can teach us something. And I said, what? What's that? And he says, look at that. Look at the screen. There was a computer, and there was a screen there, and there was a light, a blue light that was flashing. He says, look at that light. And I did, and the light became a laser, and it hit me right in the third eye of my dream body. And I could feel it had a relationship, a resonance with my physical body, which was asleep in bed. And I was able to hold that tension between the physical and the subtle body and this experiment that this entity was offering to me for his research. And then all of a sudden, and it was the light went in and out, and then in a circle 8, and then it disappeared. And he said, thank you. And I said, you're welcome. And then I returned back to the physical. Now I'm realizing I'm using language that's, I'm returning, I'm leaving, I'm in, I'm out. But all of this is language that we're just familiar with, and it's conventional language to describe an unconventional experience. Or unconventional for me, for others it might be quite ordinary, this kind of thing. But this wasn't but before computers had really become a part of my life. But it did teach me that our experience that we have in our daily lives goes into the subtle. And the subtle changes that, and we return to the physical. So I think this interplay between the subtle, imaginal, the vital, the physical, we're working in simultaneous and sequential processes. And it can be extremely bewildering, just as anyone has had the experience, they've woken up and they remember a dream that they've had, but it quickly disappears unless they make it a practice of writing it down and training their memories to make an accurate report. So I think we have all of us have a tendency towards amnesia. And I think this is a lot about what Aurobindo is uncovering, these different levels, the ascending and the descending currents, that it's very easy for us to shut down and have amnesia for these experiences. But then through practice and through life itself, bringing to us all kinds of tensions and stresses and paradoxes and impasses, we start to activate certain tendencies to create harmony rather than disharmony, and to move towards pleasure and more profound pleasure. Because ultimately compassion is the ultimate pleasure as far as I'm concerned. Offering someone assistance or getting, receiving the compassion and the kindness of others. These are deeply pleasurable experiences, which, I think we should encourage. But I do think we should be very, very respectful of the ego and why we all have one. And those who claim that they don't, I think you should avoid. You don't want to live with someone who says they don't have an ego. I think we want to be free of our egos, but not ego-less. Because I think those who are egoless have a terrible time of making sense of the world, and they often create very toxic conditions for others. So anyway, I hope some of that made sense.
Thank you so much, everyone. I feel like this has been a really valuable conversation. And even if we don't know for now clearly how that evolution looks like, even just like starting conversations about these subjects, it provides a platform for that newer possibility. So I really appreciate your time, as well as like your courage. It takes courage to speak about this subject. So thank you for that. And if there is anything I missed out on, and if you want to share anything, please feel free.
No, I think I'm getting tired. So I think I need to sign off, even if you want to keep going. But I do appreciate the conversation. It's been very interesting and very useful. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Suma. I found this very enjoyable. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you, Mateo. Thank you, John.
Nice to be with you all. Thank you.